And I'm really excited to introduce one of the other organizers, Danielle Berg, who's going to be speaking about far-ultraviolet spectra. Danielle, if you don't know her, she is a professor at UT Austin. She's also the PI of the Cost Legacy Archive Spectroscopic Survey, which I think we'll hear about today, and a co-I on UVEX, which is one of two MIDEX missions that is currently in a phase A study. She is a specialist in the local and high redshift universe, looking at chemical and stellar evolution of star-forming galaxies using a variety of different wavelengths. And for those of you that are just joining, we'll have her talk, and then afterwards there's time for questions. And then I have a few slides about the SIG in general and some notes for some meetings that are happening this summer that might be interesting, and also the next talk, which will be in a month. And if you are not Danielle, please mute yourself, and Danielle, take it away.
All right, thank you, Erica, for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for showing up. Fun to see some familiar faces. I will talk about both CLASSI and UVEX today. Some of you have heard some of these things before, but I also just wanted to take the opportunity, some of the more recent discoveries we've had for rest-frame far ultraviolet spectra, and kind of what's missing for the future, what we really need to keep our eye on still. So I'm sure, I don't think I've ever given a talk where Jess has actually been on before when I show her figure, but this beautiful figure is something I like to use in a lot of my talks to start to motivate why I really care about the rest frame far ultraviolet. And the reason is because galaxies evolve. I started studying galaxy evolution using just optical metallicity diagnostics, which are great. They build up over time with star formation. But of course, things get really messy and complicated. We have gas being kicked out into the circumgalactic and intergalactic medium. We lose metals that way. We can also create pristine gas that can dilute our metal content and really just start to make the chemical composition of our galaxies a lot more messy. So the far ultraviolet in this way is really powerful. I'm going to talk about a lot of the different features it has that allow us to study all those different processes that play a role. But also it's really unique in the fact that we've had a lot of access to it in the last few decades with the Hubble Space Telescope starting nearby galaxies. Last month, if you were around when Gwen Rudy spoke, you would hear a lot about how we've been able to do studies of higher redshift objects, 2 to 3, still with the same ultraviolet window. And now with James Webb Space Telescope and the future, we have really high redshift studies all from the same window. So it's a really unique opportunity to link galaxy evolution across cosmic time with the same window. So what do we all have in the ultraviolet? I like to start with just this kind of beautiful image that comes from some Muse integral field unit spectroscopy of H alpha here. And then in the center is just the little COS acquisition image in the near V showing a really complex star cluster that's ionizing a lot of gas around it. And from something like this, we can get lots of really cool features when we look in the ultraviolet. We can start to get emission lines that are very high ionization, like helium-2. We can start to get things that are diagnostic of our nebular gas. Carbon-3 is a good density diagnostic. We can start to get things that are tracing the escape of ionizing photons like Lyman alpha, or even higher energy photons like carbon-4. And I guess since Ed is on here, I should mention that silicon-3 also exists in the ultraviolet, and understanding kind of the different components of dust is also really interesting and important, all from the ultraviolet. As we move on to other features, we also have really effective diagnostics of the young massive star population. So what you're seeing here are just some Starburst 99 models held at a constant metallicity, but constant age, but we're increasing the metallicity from about 5% to 2 times solar. And you start to see some of these features really change and be really sensitive to the metallicity of the massive stars. On the other hand, we can hold metallicity constant and start to age from about 1 million to 10 million years, and again, start to see some of these ultraviolet features that are very sensitive and diagnostic of our massive star populations. We also have numerous absorption features that help us trace the interstellar medium, both in terms of trying to look at very low ionization that's coincidence with neutral hydrogen to understand the metallicity there, the kinematics in terms of understanding outflows and porosity of the gas and how things are getting out. And so lots of really, really sensitive features within the far ultraviolet to pull all these different components together. So one of the motivations for the Large Hubble program that I've been leading, Classy, that you heard Erica introduce, was the fact that with all these different diagnostic features, a lot of previous studies had really focused on just subsets of the far ultraviolet. For instance, if you were, maybe really interested in some of the ISM outflows or just Lyman alpha or just stellar wind features, you might only get the bluest portion of the far ultraviolet with COS, the cosmic origin spectrograph on Hubble. This is G130M. If instead you were really kind of caring about like the nebular features, you might go with G160M or G185M, but there wasn't a lot of spectra that really unified everything together. And so our goal with Classy then was to bring all these pieces together, fill in any gaps, and really finally have a comprehensive, complete atlas of UV spectra of nearby galaxies. And if you go with high resolution and high signal noise, you also get a bunch of other really cool features, starting to get really faint stellar photospheric features, fine structure features, and lots of other things. I didn't get a full look at the list, but I did see Swara was on here. She's also part of Classy, as well as nearly 50 other people. So what our galaxies in this sample look like, just to give you another quick look at them, this is similar to that first composite optical and UV image I showed you, where we have optical in this reddish orange showing you the extended kind of ionized gas, and then the stellar population in the center that's driving everything in the near UV. Of course, we're limiting ourselves because this is all we get within the COS aperture, and so there's vignetting and we don't get the full picture of the stars there, but it shows you these nice compact clusters with surrounding gas. Our general sample has properties that span a large range, and the goal for that was really to make sure that we were getting lots of different types of galaxies, so that if you were looking at galaxies of different sizes, different types, or different redshifts, we'll hopefully have something that looks similar to yours. In particular, you see we really span on the left the oxygen abundance, which is metallicity versus stellar mass, kind of the standard redshift 0 range, which from the local volume legacy is plotted in blue. And then kind of those vertical reddish orangish lines are some of the markings from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. But what's really interesting, perhaps not surprising, is the middle plot where we look at stellar mass and the star formation rate. Again, we have our redshift 0 trends that are shown at the bottom of that plot. You see this green and extended blue trend. And above that, there's some yellow lines that start to show Kate Whitaker's work that go from about redshift 1 to 2.5. And our Classy sample in purple is really, up at higher star formation rates, similar to what we see at the peak of the star formation rate density at redshift 2. Because these things are so vigorously star forming, they're very UV bright, which is why they have made great candidates to study with Hubble. But because we have this really intense star formation, this is, some more extreme objects that also help us compare to the early universe. So just to give you a quick rundown of some of the things that we've been doing, I spent a lot of time reducing the data and co-adding and being very capable with them. So I have to tell you about that quickly, just because it took up about 2 years of my time. And so just to give you a sense, this is our some of our most complicated data sets, because these are two famous dwarf galaxies, the top being 1Zwicky 18 and the bottom being SVS 0335. Very metal poor galaxies, and all the different colors that are kind of blending together are showing you that there are lots of different data sets, lots of those different grading settings and configurations that were taken for these galaxies as part of different programs. And we had the challenge of putting them all together in a uniform way to give you the most robust spectra that you could have. So to do that, we also wanted to keep the components in case you want to do different science at different resolutions. And so all the different gratings are a little bit different. So G130M, the bluest grating, has the highest spectral resolution. So we still kept that. You can still use just that grating within the Classy atlas. You can also combine it with the G160M, which has a very similar spectral resolution, just slightly lower. But so you're still at really high resolution, now unifying to a little bit redder wavelengths. And then to get the reddest part, we added the G185 grating, which is still considered to be higher resolution, but has a few more gaps. It's a little bit less sensitive. And so for cases that also had the low resolution G140L spectra available, we also combined with that just to kind of fill in and really optimize it. So depending on what your science goals are, if you need signal to noise or if you need spectral resolution, we have all those data sets accessible to you. The resulting data sample looks like a huge diversity. As you watch these spectra go by and where these things sit on the mass metallicity relationship, you're seeing lots of different ranges in UV slopes. You're seeing emission lines, absorption lines, lots of different features that show up, and definitely not one consistent picture, but a really broad range, which allows you to, again, use these as templates for a vast diversity of galaxies. Just to kind of zoom in on the progress that has been made and why the sensitivity and spectral resolution progress that have been made over the years is so important. We can show you here, purple is the Classy spectrum for SBS 0335, while the black spectrum is from the IUE. And IUE was fantastic for many, many things. Had, this really large field of view that was, really important, could do really great things. But in this case, the spectral resolution was a lot lower. And so you start to lose the details of those features. Just to show you two very contrasting examples from our sample, we find that the galaxies that are lower mass, lower metallicity, tend to be the ones that have the emission lines that we can see a lot. And due to that lower metallicity, in general, their gas has less metals and less absorption. Whereas on the other hand, for more massive galaxies, more metal-rich galaxies, we tend to not see the emission lines very often, and we start to see these really deep, numerous absorption features. And so different ways of measuring metals and things like that within these galaxies. All right, these spectra, we hope to have a data release soon for the stellar continuum fits, but they've all been fit by Peter Sanchina. And they've been done in multiple ways. So the first way, just showing you two examples here, was using kind of a standard combination of Starburst 99 single burst models, but using a linear combination that are lightweighted. So they'll be dominant by, this youngest burst that's happening, but you can add other contributions into there, and they do a really good job of fitting everything. But to test, different things, we've also looked at binaries with BPAS models. And Peter, in particular, has been working quite a bit with the new Charlot and Bruce-Wall models. And something that's really special there is they've been working on the prescriptions for the Wolf-Rayet stars. And on the right-hand side of this plot is 1640. That's the helium-2 feature. And when it's purely nebular, we see really narrow emission. None of those are shown here necessarily, but what we're starting to see is a better match to some of the broader features that we see from the winds of Wolf-Rayet stars. And so that's really exciting to see the progress in those models and what Peter is able to do with them. We are hoping to get together and finish that paper this summer, so more to come on that. We've also been looking at a big diversity of Lyman alpha properties, and so about half of these are brand new, half of them were existing because this is an archival plus new observations program. And one of the things I think that really surprised us was the number of combination profiles you kind of start to see in here. A nice example is in the bottom row, fourth from the left, you can see this kind of broad Lyman alpha absorption trough with a little double peak on top of it. And so that's really intriguing as we start to consider, the orientation, spatial resolution of the gas and with ionizing emission might be escaping these galaxies. A lot of work has been done on this recently by postdoc Wei Hu, who is working with Crystal Martin at UC Santa Barbara. Recently has done all the fitting using the TLAC code, looking at the radiative transfer, and does a really great job with all of that. And one of the things that is really interesting is this plot that he made here. This is showing you all the spectra for Classy kind of moving downward, but you're starting to see it in the observed frame. So of course, the ones at the top are the nearest galaxies. So Lyman alpha is most at the left, and you're just seeing, you know, this really broad absorption. We aren't seeing emission from those very closest galaxies for Lyman alpha. And as you start to move out in redshift, you start to see the Lyman alpha peak pop up and move outward. And so this is a really interesting progression. Of course, one of the big challenges is we're looking through a limited aperture. So the galaxies that are closest also means that we're not getting the most extended emission that's further out, whereas the galaxies at the bottom here are, you know, redshifts closer to like 0.3, where we can really get the full galaxy at more of its extended gas within that aperture. And so, you know, this probably isn't surprising to many of you, but what we're finding, of course, is that it's really important, not just the viewing angle, but also how much of the galaxy you're actually observing, because Lyman alpha resonantly scatters. And so it's also coming from these far out extents farther away from the galaxy. And so you really need to get as much of the galaxy within your aperture as possible if you want to get all of the emission for things that have higher channels of neutral hydrogen. In terms of outflows, a lot of work has been done recently by Xinfeng, who has been working with Tim Heckman as a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. And I believe Xinfeng is starting as a fellow with partially working with Alison Strom at Northwestern next year. So we're very excited for him. But we started, you know, taking our highest resolution spectra and trying to fit just some multi-component Gaussian fits to be simple. Of course, outflows can have all sorts of crazy shapes, but just starting with, you know, 2 components as an initial fit. So here's an example of that here, where you're having a static ISM component, which is going to be at velocity 0. And then you're adding an outflow component. Not all galaxies, you know, need an extra component like this, but in this particular one, you can see the outflow has a center of about minus 350 kilometers per second. And this one's also fun too, because you're seeing some really nice fluorescent emission just past 1,000. And so these fits were done for all of the galaxies. And then Xinfeng, of course, converted this information and started looking at some of these other properties, such as our outflows in terms of, you know, the mass loading factor and things like that. So in particular, this plot on the right, there's stellar mass on the top axis, or circular velocity, which is related on the bottom. And we're looking at this, you know, mass loading factor. And there's some other points in the background, some previous galaxies that have been done with these diamonds that have been studied. But what's special about Classy is we're really filling in this range where there hasn't been a ton of data before in a uniform analysis. And we're seeing the exact same trends, maybe slightly different slope of what had been predicted before, but it's really consistent. These mass loading factors that scale with stellar mass all the way out to the lowest stellar mass galaxies that we see. And this slope ends up being kind of right in between a purely momentum and a purely energy driven outflow. And so we find that there are both components there that are then being injected into the gas. Simon Gazania is a postdoc that's working with me here at UT. He has done a lot of great work observationally, but he's also been working on some simulations with the group in Lyon that is doing a lot of radiative transfer. Now this result we'll have out soon. He's resubmitted his paper, and as soon as we get the acceptance, we'll put it on the archive. But what's really special about this is a simulation of one galaxy that was progressed over time, over many years of redshift, and we looked at lots of different viewing angles. And the surprising result that Simon found was that we could start by trying to fit our different components in Classy using different viewing angles of this galaxy that might have, you know, different gas properties happening in different portions of the galaxy, and then also changing the aperture to mimic the different portions of the galaxy that fit in the COS aperture. And by doing so, amazingly, he found that he could find initially a blue fit, for instance, that was just due to the viewing angle that did a pretty good job. And then when he started to adjust the aperture, he could start to get really good customized fits to all of our galaxies. This is like kind of hard for some people to swallow because, you know, we think of these line of sight observations that we make for all our different galaxies as being really diagnostic, but it really could just be a viewing angle of something much more complex. And so he's with a single galaxy, he's been able to match all of the low ionization lines as complexes simultaneously fit for the entire range of our sample. He also looked at where different components came from spatially. And so again, you're looking at just one viewing angle of this galaxy. And in the top left plot, he's showing you just a continuum image and then a couple of different apertures that he did extractions on, stepping out from the center of the brightest pixel. Below that, he has highlighted where the fluorescence emission is mostly coming from. In the middle is where the resonance or all of these absorption features are resonant, so where that's really coming from strongly. And then he has a velocity map on the right as well. And so one of the things that was interesting is there's still not a lot understood about where fluorescent emission comes from. And in this simulation, it seems like it has a different spatial extent from the resonance gas. And in fact, we get a lot of it where there are lower column densities of this resonant gas. And so in the upper right, you can just kind of see some of these different extractions starting from the brightest pixel and then radii of 600 parsecs, 1800 parsecs in the entire galaxy, and how that changed, you know, how strong the absorption is, how much continuum have, and of course, as we go farther out, we get much stronger fluorescent emission shown. All right, I've been really excited to not just look at Lyman alpha as a resonant feature, but there are several other resonant features that you can look at. And I first, in terms of emission, and I first started getting interested in this when Ann Jascott published her study showing this double peaked silicon-4 emission that I had never seen before. And that was really exciting to me because silicon-4 is obviously much higher ionization than you know, neutral hydrogen gas that Lyman alpha has to escape through. We would expect these lines to look all exactly the same if all of kind of like the CGM gas that this emission is traveling through was all uniform and the same. Then we would expect everything to mimic each other. But what we find instead, once we start examining some of these different things, is that we start to see very different profiles. So this is one of my favorite galaxies that's also in Classy. And you can see that it has beautiful double peaked carbon-4 emission. I'm going to talk about this plot in this galaxy more in a little bit. So just look at the upper part where you're seeing this double fit to the carbon-4 emission lines, and then just a damped Lyman alpha profile. So very, very different. Of course, when we got our Classy spectra and went a little bit higher resolution, and a little bit deeper, we did see a little tiny emission line at the bottom of that trough, which is cool. But these look very different, telling us that the distribution of the neutral hydrogen gas and the carbon-4 gas in our circumgalactic medium are very different. Here's, again, that same galaxy, but with two others to compare to. And you can see the range of profiles of the carbon-4 versus the Lyman alpha in terms of their strengths. And we're also looking at now a big sample of double peaked carbon-4. So each of those lines is double peaked and looking at a large variation of profiles. And that's really exciting. Along these same lines, as I mentioned, this blue spectrum on the left here, greenish blue, is that same one that I showed you, that little tiny little emission feature, but it's in log space now. So it kind of really blows it up. But it's a really deep trough, lots of absorption and a little bit of emission. And so this is kind of piquing our curiosity, is this evidence of holes, of channels of escape for the Lyman alpha. And we've had a follow-up survey that we lovingly call high class that is looking at the H1 21 centimeter emission with the Green Bank telescope. And so you can see these two profiles do in fact, we get a nice emission line there that we can turn into an H1 mass. And these things do have really high gas fractions, not surprising for these types of dwarf galaxies being around 80%. And so to be able to get this Lyman alpha emission coming out from something like that does suggest something like a hole. All right, for our nebular diagnostics, postdoc Matilda Mangazi, who's working with Beth and James at Space Telescope, has been looking at all the wonderful nebular emission lines we can use in the far ultraviolet. This one is also combined with the optical emission lines because they probe different ionization states and are sensitive to different density ranges. But it's really kind of fun to see a plot like this and the many detections we have for each different diagnostic. Some of them don't have a lot. In the bottom right-hand corner, this is nitrogen 4. I'll talk about this more. We never really see nitrogen 4 emission, but we have it in 4 of our classy galaxies, which is exciting. We have lots of these carbon 3 detections that are really nicely spanning this. But one of the long-standing problems that's been hinted at and is amplified by classy is the fact that we really get different densities when we look at these different lines. And so perhaps not surprising that we get different things between the different ionization states. So in the pink here, you're looking at the optical sulfur 2 density diagnostic, which is always around a few hundred. That's the low density limit. That's very standard for ionized gas for H2 regions. But all the points above that come from these UV lines, the nitrogen 4, silicon 3, and carbon 3 ratios. And so there's been a longstanding question of, is this really just that the higher ionization gas tends to be at the center of these galaxies, is really dense in this kind of more compact region, or are we getting a systematic we don't understand in the ultraviolet? Are these density diagnostics artificially high because they're coming from the UV and it hasn't been calibrated as well? One of the problems that we look at a lot in my line of work is trying to understand how we even produce some of these emission lines. So this is a really nice plot from Anna Feltry that is just showing some ionizing or some SEDs here. So we're seeing gray is some AGN models, and then we have an orange and a blue model where the orange model is higher metallicity and the blue model is lower metallicity. And some of the emission features I've just showed you include the carbon 4 emission feature, which is happening at about 48 electron volts. And you can see that line comes down and just gets the bottom of the blue, but it doesn't do a very good job of producing it. And emission that we get from helium-2, which actually comes from helium-3 and recombination, that's at 54 electron volts. And our current stellar models aren't able to reach that at all. And so that's another thing that we're really interested in looking at is what are we missing in these regions? Well, that's in terms of stellar physics or other extreme objects there that we haven't identified yet. Another reminder as I move on to talk about more of these nebular details is that carbon 4 is really good at absorbing things, okay? So carbon 4 gas that's around. So this is just kind of a representative profile that I think people who have studied carbon 4 see a lot. This is from the Megasaur survey from Jane Rigby. And this complex profile actually, first includes a stellar continuum, this P Cygni profile in carbon 4. And so you can remove that. And then you're left with this deep absorption trough where, the absorption here is so strong that it's actually saturated because the left line should have a stronger absorption, has a stronger oscillator strength than the right line. So there's the theoretical ratio for comparison. So it's really good at absorbing. We usually see a lot of carbon 4 gas and it does a great job. But some of our galaxies, we see pure emission, which is really interesting. So a little pilot study, 2 of my favorite galaxies that are in classy. I just tend to call them J10 and J14, but we'll start here with their UV spectra that are showing a lot of these beautiful emission lines. Not only do we see the carbon 4 emission, they have helium-2 that I talked about recently, and some lines that I hadn't been really familiar with until we did classy, which silicon 4, which we saw from that Ann-Jascott spectrum, but also oxygen-4 emission lines that are peaking up here. Very high ionization, very rare. In the optical, we also see when we get really good spectra, really deep spectra, some faint features that are also hard to explain, such as neon 5 emission that comes, from something like 100 electron volts. So you're starting to get into the X-ray regime. Iron 5 emission, argon 4, really booming helium 2, lots of really kind of crazy emission lines. So coming back to these spectra, first, I'll show you here on the right for the ultraviolet, I have the helium-2 profile, and the green profile is the oxygen-3 nebular profile. So what this is showing you is that they have very similar velocity widths. They're very narrow. They're about 80 kilometers per second in full width half max. And that really suggests a nebular origin of this helium-2. Usually when we see things that are related to stellar ionization or winds, you're seeing much broader features in the helium-2. Carbon-4 was also fun because once you blow that up, not only do you see that the lines are wider than the oxygen-3, but you start to see this hint at that double profile I mentioned. So in fact, if you fit the stronger emission line, carbon-4 1548, with a doublet, and then use their theoretical emissivities to infer the 1550 line, this is the fit that you get. For J10, it does an unbelievable job. It's a really good match, which tells you there's really probably hardly any carbon-4 gas along the line of sight absorbing. There's obviously a little bit because it's making it double peaked, it's resonantly scattering, but really we're getting most of that emission right back out exactly how we expect it. J1418 isn't quite perfect. It's pretty close to the uncertainty, but this tells us there's a little more absorption along the line of sight that is causing this ratio to be off. But also really interesting that, oh, my other descriptor, there it goes, didn't pop up yet, that the left peak here looks to be dominant for J1418, which could indicate some inflows. And in fact, the absorption lines in this galaxy seem to be just slightly, the trough is slightly redshifted from a velocity of 0. So with these galaxies, Grace Oliver, who is now a postdoc at Texas A&M, fit their stellar continua, was able to subtract it so we can get great emission line fits, but also use that as input to photoionization models. So we have the youngest, bright massive stars that are ionizing this gas, and we're inputting that into our cloudy models. We also have a lot of other constraints on our cloudy models because we have these beautiful optical spectra. So we can measure gas densities, we can measure oxygen abundance, we can measure different ionization parameters and try to kind of fine tune our models a little bit. Grace compared this to a larger sample of galaxies that I looked at in 2019 and did a whole bunch of models, and photonization models always look complicated, but the most important thing here is that we're looking at ionization on the X and then the strength of different line ratios on the Y. And the different colored bands are different metallicities ranging from really low, 0.5% solar, up to 30% solar. And then the points are color coded by their oxygen abundance metal matches. And they do really nice jobs for all of these low ionization lines. So they're showing you in the upper left-hand corner what their ionization potential energy ranges are. And we get good fits within these models. However, as we started moving to our higher ionization emission lines, we started to find a mismatch. Now, this problem has been known for a really long time for helium-2 in the lower right-hand box. That's not surprising. But even things that are a little bit less high ionization, like neon-3, argon-4, and even some of our oxygen-3 points, we started to see this deviation. And it's really progressive with higher ionization. And so we're clearly missing something in our models or another component that is driving these high ionization emission lines. So just to throw something at it, Grace added some simple black bodies. And so for each of the galaxies here, there's a stars only column and then a stars plus a black body. Same type of photonization models for some different lines where we are increasing an ionization potential from top to bottom. So O2 at the top and O4 at the bottom. And We've looked at a lot of different things. One of the things that was really challenging is that if you add in something like just shocks or some standard AGN models, you get all of your line ratios being changed. And we wanted to consistently match them all at the same time. And Grace was only able to do that when she added just a simple black body, somewhere around 70 to 80,000 Kelvin, and being a pretty large fraction of the total luminosity. So for one of the galaxies, the best fit looks like this. The observed UV spectrum is shown in black. The stellar continuum fit from binary stars from BPAS is shown in green. And when it was fit to the actual continuum level, but it's now scaled down because it makes up about 40% of that total light. And then she needed to add this very high temperature black body that ends up being 60% of this total ionizing light. And you can see that it doesn't make a big difference at the lower wavelengths, but it makes a, at the higher wavelengths, but it makes a really big difference right where we care about these high energies like helium-2 and carbon-4. So you can see the circles of the lime green, that's where the energies we would get from just our stars. But what we get from the black body is much higher and allows us to bump up to the observed points that we need. So we still don't know exactly what this black body component could be. We don't want to constrain it too much. We wanted to throw this out to the community and say, like, what could it be? Do we need like new low metallicity stellar atmospheric models, more massive stars, strip binaries, ultra luminous X-ray sources, lots of exciting things to look at that we're still interested in exploring. One of these avenues that we've been motivated to explore is, well, what do the really metal poor stars look like in the UV? And before recently, we really had no idea. There was 0 very metal poor stars below 10% solar that had UV spectra. It was kind of crazy. I mean, they have to be really close. And so that's a challenge. But John Chisholm submitted a Hubble program to get 3 stars, and then Grace Telford, a postdoc at Rutgers, analyzed this data. We originally thought that all 3 were less than 10% solar, but one of them ended up being about 14%, with even the very lowest mass. So we have Sexton A, WLM, and the lowest mass, the lowest metallicity galaxy is Leo P, which has a single O star in it. It's kind of that perfect H2 region model. And what you start to see is that the wind features start to become really, really weak as we go to these very low metallicities. This might imply some longer stellar lifetimes, low opacity to ionizing photons. And this is very low number statistics. This is 3 stars. But if we start to look at their rotation, start to look at their V sin I, and we compare to what we expect from the Small Magellanic Cloud O dwarfs, we start to see that our stars exist at a point that would indicate pretty fast rotation. We're starting to see rotation rates, up to 300 to 400% for these types of stars, which may indicate that these low metallicity stars are rotating faster than we expected, and that could also affect their ionizing output. Okay, so lots of good things. I hope you're excited about Class E and we'll maybe use those spectra, but there really are a lot of things we still don't know. And that has motivated my participation in UVEX. And so to build up to that, I'll tell you about some of the things I've been thinking about. So one of the big problems is that we have great nebular diagnostics in the optical that have been known for a long time. They've been well calibrated and well studied. Most of you are probably familiar with the BPT diagram, where we look at ratios of oxygen 3 to H beta versus nitrogen 2 to H alpha. There's some other versions of this plot as well. And try to use that to distinguish between star-forming galaxies and AGN. Of course, we found that there are some bleedovers between these, and especially, our very metal poor kind of extreme star-forming galaxies can kind of start to look like some of these AGN in here. And so it can be challenging. As we go to higher redshifts, some of these diagnostics just become really difficult to use because they, go out of our observed frames. So there's been a lot of interest in looking at the rest frame ultraviolet and seeing what we can calibrate. One of the proposed diagnostics uses carbon-3 versus over helium-2 versus carbon-4 over helium-2. And using AGN and star-forming galaxy models, we find a really nice separation on here. We do need better understanding of these things, though. As I showed you already, just with carbon-4, these lines are really complicated. They can have contributions from the stellar continuum. They can have contributions from interstellar medium absorption. And this just makes them really difficult to interpret when you have one integrated spectrum. There's also been a lot of interest in trying to learn what the metallicity is from these galaxies. And so this is a plot from Nell Byler's work where she looked at, again, some of these UV diagnostics and ran a bunch of grids and used a bunch of observations to try to, infer what the metallicity is from this. But when looking at what you actually infer from the ultraviolet versus what you measure from the optical, we still have a huge amount of dispersion, a huge amount of uncertainty. And so I think there's still clearly a lot of work that needs to be done here. So I'll first say a little something about carbon. I think carbon is becoming really, really important to us for many reasons. It's been kind of our strongest emission line that we've observed in the far ultraviolet after Lyman alpha. So especially at higher redshifts, when we don't see Lyman alpha, this is kind of the beacon we've looked for in a lot of galaxies. It's playing a huge role in these diagnostic diagrams. And then things like, carbon-2 have recently become really powerful ways to look at galaxies with ALMA in the high redshift universe. But especially in very low metallicity galaxies, low mass galaxies, we still are not really understanding what we expect from carbon. Now, this is something I've thought about for a while, and it's still very confusing even after my studies. But if we look at the carbon to oxygen ratio, theoretically, we expect this to be constant. Primary means that something is metallicity independent. And so because we expect both carbon and oxygen to be produced, a lot of times by more massive stars. And the only way that we know to produce carbon is just from the triple alpha process. We would expect that we would just get a constant ratio. But observations, especially from the faint object spectrograph in like the 1990s, started to suggest that there might be an increasing trend. And questions were starting to be asked. Is this due to, metallicity dependent winds in massive stars ejecting more carbon? Is this due to different timescales that the elements are produced on, and maybe we're preferentially losing oxygen with supernovae? So a lot of questions open with this. And I've tried to study this. These are the points that I studied in my 2019 work: a small range in oxygen abundance and a huge range in C to O. So that makes that difficult to interpret. But we can fill in this plot over a larger range. So on the farthest left, you start to have some of these DLAs that have been studied, very metal poor DLAs. On the far right, you can start to get a lot of recombination lines from the optical. These are from more metal rich, more massive things. And then we also have a lot of halo and disk stars that are spread throughout, and you kind of see this U-shaped trend. If you play around with kind of the star formation history of galaxies in models, kind of using just some simple burst cycles, we can start to reproduce this shape if we vary the number of bursts, the duration of the bursts, and also how much oxygen leaves the galaxy or stays in the galaxy with supernova feedback, so the effective yields of oxygen. But we still aren't understanding the evolution of carbon to oxygen. So this is a preliminary plot of kind of where I'm at with things now. We have most of our local kind of dwarf galaxies that are shown in blue points with the newest measurements from Classy overlaid in green. So those are all redshift 0. And then everything that I've found in the literature around redshift 2 to 3 in yellow points. And one of the things that surprised me is that the averages between these two populations are basically identical, as well as their dispersions. And so while we need to understand the exact point of C to O, it doesn't seem like there's much evolution yet. We can also add the few, very few measurements we have at very high redshift that have come from the James Webb Space Telescope. These things have pretty large uncertainties. They do look to be slightly lower, but they're not inconsistent with the spread that we see at redshift 2. And there's been a tantalizing paper that was out recently from Tucker Jones that was looking at a very, one of these points at high redshifts that's very low metallicity, this lowest pink star, and asking, does this mean we're seeing a galaxy in a very early phase of its evolution because we're only seeing, the yields or the expectations of C to O from core collapse supernova yields? We're not yet getting any delayed carbon from asymptotic giant branch stars. And so I point to the little plot here on the left from Kobayashi that looks at the different contributions, and you can see that carbon does, have about equal amounts of core collapse supernovae and AGB stars, whereas oxygen is really dominated by those core collapse supernovae. So it could be diagnostic of very early times. Now, these are just some really simple models, but there are other lines that we've seen very recently that are intriguing that we do expect to see at very low metallicities in young stellar ages. And so in particular, all the lines that I've talked about so far, but also drawing your attention to the nitrogen 4 lines at 1483 and 1486, and this quintuplet of nitrogen 3 lines around 1750. So a lot of excitement has been made by this redshift 10.6 galaxy called GNZ11. It's shown in this red plot on the left. And while we seriously hardly ever see these lines, it has both nitrogen 4 and nitrogen 3 emission. Peterson Chinna recently published a paper comparing it to one of the galaxies in Classy, Markarian 996, which shows this booming nitrogen 3 emission, but doesn't show nitrogen 4 emission. The other thing that's really interesting about the nitrogen 4 emission is that we're only seeing the 1486 line, which in this lower plot, you're seeing how the ratio changes on the x-axis versus nebular gas density. And in order to get, basically no 1483, but for a lot of 1486, you start to get to really high gas densities. So there's been a lot of interest. These other papers, Alex Cameron, Danielle Scher, Roberto Maialino, are suggesting things like, really interesting AGN, Wolf-Rayets, kind of extreme stellar clusters, lots of different really exciting things that we don't yet know how to interpret. I like to point out that there are a handful of these observations that we've seen before. So here are some higher redshift things that do have nitrogen 4 detections. I think with Classy, I have counted that there are 9 nitrogen 4 detections in all of existing galaxy spectra, 9. And only this stack from redshift 2 to 6 and the GNZ11 one both have nitrogen 3 and nitrogen 4, but I'll show you a few other of the nitrogen 3 detections as well. So in total, I think we have exactly 5 of these other galaxies that have potential nitrogen 3 detections. So very low samples. And so it's something we really don't understand well yet at all.
Hey, Danielle, I just want to draw your attention to the time so there's time for questions.
Okay, yeah, I'll wrap up. Sounds good. So yeah, we'll skip this. I never know exactly how long I'm going to talk in these things. So I'll just briefly mention that I am a part of UVEX. It is going to be, hopefully it'll get selected for funding. It'll be our next ultraviolet observatory. It has a lot of capabilities, but I have been really focused on the spectroscopy, in particular looking at carbon at very low metallicities where we don't have a lot of diagnostics. And this is going to be made possible because it's much more sensitive, and it also has coverage throughput out through much further wavelengths. So let me show you that plot here. So this is showing you the throughput of what we currently have with Hubble, with COS and STIS, and then the UVEX throughput is supposed to be much, much higher. So 10% higher over a much larger wavelength regime. And so we'll be able to also observe these bright emission lines over much higher redshifts. So we're really excited about that. My part of this will be to select those low metallicity galaxies, make sure we have good optical spectra before we go ahead and observe them. We're supposed to detect lots of these things. One of the downsides of UVEX is that it is only going to be a resolution of about 1,000 or 2,000. And so a lot of the detailed features that we want to see, absorption line kinematics, resolving, Lyman alpha, resolving these very close lines like the nitrogen 3 quintuplet, we aren't going to be able to do. And so I will finish with, I wanted to highlight the progress that we require moving forward. So with things like the simulation work we're seeing that are suggesting different holes and different densities of gases that our emission is escaping through, I think the future really requires either having really good, efficient aperture stepping we can do, or IFU. I would love to have a UV IFU in space. I think we need to make sure we still have options that have high enough spectral resolution so we can really study the kinematics we want to do. And then we just need higher sensitivity because we're doing a really good job with our UV lines so far that are coming from the center of galaxies. But if we really want to understand the variations we're seeing that are extending out with outflows out into the circumgalactic medium gas, we just need to have higher sensitivity as well. So I hope you will play with Classy. I hope you will look forward to UVEX, and I hope we can keep working towards the next generation of UV spacecraft. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. That was really great. I want to open it up for just a couple of questions, being mindful of the time. If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand. Ed, go for it.
Okay, you showed Lyman alpha emission in the core of the absorption line and attributed it to holes where the photons could leak out. But isn't it equally possible that you're seeing a resonant re-radiation, these photons diffusing out in a low dust environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we just cannot tell without having better spatial resolution. Of course, what we've been trying to play with is kind of these aperture sizes. And my postdoc Simon now is actually trying to look at some programs that maybe vary around these nearby galaxies to see what kind of variations we get, on the edges and things like that to see if things are resonantly scattering in. But you're right, we can't really tell exactly what the scenario is with the information that we have at the moment.
Of course, these missions would be double peaked, but you may not resolve it. But they're double peaked because once you get out of the line core, the photons get more liberated.
Yep, that's right. Absolutely. That's a great point.
Okay, I see another question from Chris Churchill.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I was curious about your black body spectrum, and I'm not familiar with how well the atomic constants and atomic data are known for some of these transitions that you were working with. And I was just curious if you toyed with the idea of like what kind of fractional uncertainty in the atomic constants that are in the models might be able to help you close the gap.
Yeah, that is a great question. And, one that has come to my attention recently because I realized we don't know much about, for instance, those nitrogen lines that are popping up. We don't know a lot about their atomic data, and I couldn't find anything published more recently than, 20 years ago on it. So some of them are better known than others. Some of them there's been a lot of updates on, like the different oxygen lines. We feel those are pretty secure. But you bring up a great point and something we should explore further for some of the less studied ions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how you'd do it, but I could imagine tweaking the constants a little bit in the models and seeing which direction things go and what magnitude.
Yeah, maybe what we need, and then see how crazy different that is. That's great.
So I have one last quick question. When you talked about some of the HST observations, especially in the nearby galaxies, and they're limited by the aperture size, is there any plans to try and go back and like cover slightly different parts of the galaxy just to like see what is really happening if you have a bigger aperture?
Yeah, so that is something I wanted one of my postdocs to submit this cycle, but of course, hopefully everyone survived the deadline yesterday, but we didn't get that one in. So we'll look to the next cycle, but trying to look at our best targets, and yeah, just trying to kind of, dither around a little bit with some pointings to see what kind of variations we get. I think would be really interesting.
I mean, yeah, especially combined with that simulation where you could like recreate a lot of different, seemingly different features in the same galaxy. I feel like I'm kind of troubled by that.
Yeah, it is troubling.
Yeah. Okay, so just to finish up, I just have one slide that I want to share of a couple of community notices before everybody disappears. If you're interested in self-nominating for the START, the Habitable Worlds Observatory Science and Technology, I forget what the A stands for, team, that's due June 5th. So in just a little less than 2 weeks. There's a couple of meetings that might be of interest. There's a Science with Habitable Worlds Observatory and Beyond happening at in Baltimore in July. And then a Winds Throughout the Universe meeting that's happening in October in Annapolis, Maryland. And then lastly, I just wanted to advertise for the next talk, which will be in four weeks, in a month. June 22nd, our speaker is going to be Cassie Lockhouse, and she's going to be talking about the non-equilibrium circumgalactic medium. I think it'll be the same Zoom link, and we'll send reminders on the email list ahead of time. So I want to thank our wonderful speaker, Danielle, again, and thank all of you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next time. And self-nominate for the START.